Today, I want to share with you a chapter of my life that taught me what true strength really means. This is a story about how one moment can change everything, and how a family can either fall apart or come together in the face of unimaginable challenges. I had been married to James for 10 wonderful years. We lived in a small house in Detroit, Michigan, where James worked at the Ford Motor Company assembly plant. He was a skilled machinist, proud of his work and well-respected by his supervisors and colleagues. We had 3 children: David, who was 12, Sarah, who was 9, and little Matthew, who had just turned 6. Life wasn't luxurious, but it was good. James brought home a steady paycheck every week, enough to cover our mortgage, put food on the table, and even save a little bit for the children's future education. We had plans and dreams like any young family. James often talked about getting promoted to supervisor, and we hoped to buy a bigger house in a better neighborhood someday. James was the kind of man who never missed a day of work. He took pride in his reliability and skill. Every morning, he would get up at 5:30, drink his coffee while reading the newspaper, kiss me goodbye, and head off to the factory. He would come home at 6 in the evening, tired but satisfied with an honest day's work. The children adored their father. He was patient with their questions, helped them with homework, and always found time to play catch in the backyard or read bedtime stories. On weekends, he would take them fishing at the nearby lake or teach David how to work with tools in our small garage workshop. I remember that Tuesday morning in March 1965 like it was yesterday. James left for work just like any other day, humming a tune and reminding me that he might be a little late because they were trying to meet a production deadline. I told him I would keep dinner warm and gave him an extra kiss, not knowing it would be the last normal morning of our lives. The phone call came at 2:15 in the afternoon. I was folding laundry while Matthew played with his toy cars on the living room floor. When the phone rang, I expected it to be my mother or maybe a neighbor. Instead, it was a man from the factory whose voice I didn't recognize. He told me there had been an accident at the plant and that James had been seriously injured. My legs went weak and I had to sit down on the kitchen chair. The man said James was being taken to Detroit General Hospital and that I should come immediately. He wouldn't give me any details about what had happened, just that it was serious. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, to watch the children and drove to the hospital in a panic. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely steer the car. I kept telling myself that everything would be okay, that James was strong and would recover from whatever had happened. But deep down, I knew from the tone of that phone call that our lives were about to change forever. At the hospital, a doctor met me in the emergency waiting room. He was a kind man with gentle eyes, but I could see the concern in his face before he even spoke. He told me that James had been working on one of the large pressing machines when something went wrong with the safety mechanism. James's right hand and forearm had been caught in the machine before anyone could shut it down. The injuries were severe, requiring immediate surgery. The doctor explained that they were doing everything they could to save his arm. But even in the best-case scenario, James would never regain full use of his hand. I sat in that waiting room for 6 hours while surgeons worked to repair the damage. Mrs. Peterson brought the children to the hospital after school, and I had to explain to them that Daddy had been hurt at work, but that the doctors were taking good care of him. David, being the oldest, understood the seriousness of the situation, but Sarah and Matthew just wanted to know when Daddy would come home. When the surgery was finally over, the doctor came to speak with us. He had managed to save James's arm, but the damage to his hand was extensive. Multiple bones were crushed, tendons were severed, and there was significant nerve damage. James would need months of physical therapy, and even then, he would likely have very limited use of his right hand. For a machinist whose livelihood depended on precise hand movements and the ability to operate complex machinery, this news was devastating. The doctor gently explained that James would never be able to return to his job at the factory. His working life, as he had known it, was over at the age of 32. When I was finally allowed to see James in the recovery room, my heart broke. This strong, capable man who had always been the protector and provider for our family lay there, looking so vulnerable and defeated. His right arm was heavily bandaged and suspended in a complex system of pulleys and weights. James was groggy from the anesthesia, but when he saw me, tears started flowing down his face. He tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. He kept saying he was sorry, as if the accident had been his fault. I held his good hand and told him that none of this was his fault and that we would get through it together. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital visits, insurance paperwork, and trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for the children. James remained in the hospital for 10 days, undergoing additional surgeries and beginning the painful process of physical therapy. Each day I would visit, bringing him updates about the children and trying to keep his spirits up. But I could see that James was falling into a deep depression. The man who had always been optimistic and solution-oriented was becoming withdrawn and hopeless. He would stare out the hospital window for hours, barely responding when I tried to engage him in conversation. The physical pain was bad enough, but the emotional devastation was worse. When James finally came home, the reality of our new situation became clear. Simple tasks that he had always taken for granted, like buttoning his shirt or holding a coffee cup, were now either impossible or extremely difficult. He needed help with basic activities, which was humiliating for a man who had always been so independent. The financial implications were immediate and devastating. James's worker compensation would cover his medical expenses, but it provided only a fraction of his regular salary. Our savings, which had never been substantial, were quickly depleted by the additional costs associated with his care and the loss of income. I had never worked outside our home before. Like many women of that era, I had focused on raising children and managing the household, while James provided the income. Suddenly, at the age of 30, I needed to figure out how to support a family of 5, with no job experience and very limited skills. I started by taking in sewing work from neighbors and local businesses. I would sit at our kitchen table late into the night, hemming pants and altering dresses for a few dollars per item. The work was tedious and the pay was minimal, but it was something I could do from home while still caring for James and the children. But the sewing income wasn't nearly enough to cover our expenses. Our mortgage payment alone was more than I could earn in a month of sewing. I started looking into other options, but jobs for women were limited in 1965, especially for women with no education beyond high school and no work experience. Meanwhile, James's condition was not improving as much as we had hoped. The physical therapy was painful and progress was slow. More importantly, his mental state was deteriorating. He would spend entire days in bed refusing to eat or interact with the children. He kept saying that he was worthless now, that his family would be better off without him. David, my 12-year-old, was watching all of this and trying to be the man of the house. He started doing chores that had always been James's responsibility, like taking out the trash and trying to fix things that broke around the house. He was growing up too fast, carrying burdens that no child should have to carry. The breaking point came 3 months after the accident, when David approached me with a decision that broke my heart. He told me that he wanted to quit school and get a job to help support the family. At 12, he was too young to work legally, but he had heard about boys who lied about their age to get jobs in factories or as delivery boys. I was horrified by this suggestion, but David was insistent. He had done the math and realized that even my sewing income, combined with James's disability, payments wasn't enough to keep us in our house. He said he could see the stress I was under and wanted to help. His childhood was ending before my eyes. I sat David down and explained that education was the most important thing for his future, that dropping out of school would limit his opportunities for the rest of his life. But he was mature enough to understand our financial reality. He pointed out that if we lost the house, he wouldn't be able to stay in school anyway. It was around this time that the social isolation began. Friends and relatives who had always been part of our lives started visiting less frequently. Some people didn't know what to say about James's condition, so they found it easier to just stay away. Others seemed to view our misfortune as somehow contagious, as if associating with us might bring bad luck into their own lives. James's brother Robert, who had always been close to us, started making excuses for why he couldn't visit or help out. When I finally confronted him about his absence, he said that seeing James in his current condition was too difficult for him. He suggested that perhaps this was God's way of testing our faith, and that we needed to accept our situation with more grace. These attitudes from people we had considered close friends and family were almost as painful as the accident itself. At a time when we needed support the most, we found ourselves increasingly alone. The social safety net that we had assumed would be there simply didn't exist, at least not for us. I began to understand that we were going to have to rely entirely on our own resources To survive this crisis, there were no government programs to help families like ours, no disability services beyond the minimal worker compensation payments, and no community organizations designed to help people transition to life with disabilities. The children were struggling too, each in their own way. David was taking on too much responsibility and losing his childhood. Sarah, at 9, was confused about why Daddy was so sad all the time, and why we couldn't afford things we used to buy. Little Matthew was too young to understand the situation, but he could sense the tension and anxiety in our home. James's depression was getting worse despite my efforts to encourage him and help him see possibilities for the future. He had always defined himself by his ability to provide for his family, and without that role, he felt lost and worthless. The physical limitations were challenging, but the psychological impact was devastating. I realized that I was going to have to become the primary breadwinner for our family, something I had never imagined I would need to do. The sewing work wasn't sustainable long-term, and I needed to find something that would provide a more reliable income. But with 3 children to care for and a husband who needed constant support, my options were extremely limited. I started looking for work that I could do from home or during hours when the children were at school. A neighbor told me about a woman who ran a small catering business from her home and needed help with food preparation. The pay wasn't great, but it was more than the sewing work, and I could do it during the day while the children were at school. The work was physically demanding. I would wake up at 5 in the morning to prepare food for office, lunches, and small events, then rush home to get the children ready for school. After they left, I would go back to the catering kitchen to continue preparation and cleanup. I would return home just as the children got back from school, exhausted but trying to hide it. James's condition remained largely unchanged. Some days were better than others, but the depression seemed to have settled over him like a permanent cloud. He had given up on physical therapy, claiming it wasn't helping anyway. He would sit in his chair by the window, staring out at the street, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share with anyone. The financial pressure was relentless. Even with the catering work, we were barely making ends meet. I had to make impossible choices every week, deciding which bills to pay and which ones to let slide. The mortgage company was sending increasingly urgent notices, and I lived in constant fear that we would lose our home. It was during this time that I had to make one of the most difficult decisions of my life. We owned a small car that James had been so proud of, a 1963 Chevrolet that he had saved for months to buy. It was our only reliable transportation, but it was also our most valuable asset. I realized that I was going to have to sell it to keep us from losing the house. I didn't tell James about my decision until after I had found a buyer. When I finally broke the news to him, it was like watching a man's spirit break completely. That car had represented his independence, his ability to provide for his family, his identity as a working man. Losing it felt like losing the last piece of who he used to be. David's academic performance began to suffer as the stress at home increased. His teachers called to express concern about his declining grades and his apparent lack of focus in class. When I met with his teacher, she gently suggested that David might benefit from speaking with the school counselor about what was happening at home, but David refused to talk to anyone about our situation. He was fiercely protective of our family's privacy and didn't want anyone at school to know about our problems. He was carrying too much weight on his young shoulders, trying to be strong for everyone while dealing with his own fears and disappointments. Sarah began having nightmares and would wake up crying in the middle of the night. She would ask me if Daddy was going to die, or if we were going to have to move away from our house. I tried to reassure her, but I could see that she wasn't convinced by my optimistic words. Children have an instinct for detecting adult anxiety, no matter how hard we try to hide it. Little Matthew, at 6, was perhaps the most resilient of us all. He seemed to accept the changes in our family with the adaptability that small children possess. But I noticed that he had stopped asking to play with Daddy, sensing somehow that James was no longer emotionally available for the rough and tumble games they used to enjoy. 6 months after the accident, I made the difficult decision to approach James's former employer about the possibility of finding me work at the factory. It was unusual for women to work in manufacturing at that time, but I was desperate and willing to do whatever was necessary to support my family. The personnel manager, Mr. Thompson, was sympathetic to our situation, but explained that there were very few positions available for women Most of the work required physical strength that women were assumed not to possess. However, he mentioned that they were looking for someone to work in the company cafeteria, serving meals to the workers during lunch breaks. The cafeteria job paid better than the catering work and provided some benefits, including health insurance that would help with James's ongoing medical needs. The hours were difficult, requiring me to work split shifts to cover both the breakfast and lunch rushes, but it was steady employment with a reliable paycheck. Taking the factory job meant leaving James alone for longer periods during the day. I worried about his state of mind and his ability to care for himself, but we had no choice. I arranged for Mrs. Peterson to check on him during the day and made sure he had easy meals prepared that he could manage with one good hand. The work at the factory cafeteria was physically demanding but straightforward. I served food, operated the cash register, and cleaned up after hundreds of workers every day. The men were generally respectful, and many of them knew about James's accident and would ask how he was doing. Their concern for our family was touching, even though most of them were struggling financially themselves. But the long hours and physical demands of the job were taking their toll on me. I would wake up at 4:30 to prepare breakfast at the factory, come home briefly to check on the family, return to work for the lunch rush, and then come home to cook dinner, help with homework, and take care of household chores. I was constantly exhausted. It was around this time that James began to show small signs of improvement. Perhaps it was seeing me work so hard to keep our family together, or perhaps it was simply the natural progression of his healing process. He started getting out of bed more, regularly and occasionally helped with simple tasks around the house. One evening, I came home from work to find James sitting at the kitchen table with David, helping him with math homework. It was the first time since the accident that I had seen him engaged in normal family activities. David's face was lit up with joy at having his father's attention, and I felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. James began to participate more in family life, though he was still far from his old self. He would read bedtime stories to Matthew, though he had to hold the book awkwardly with his left hand. He started taking short walks around the neighborhood, slowly building up his strength and endurance. The breakthrough came almost a year after the accident when James announced that he wanted to try to find work. He had been thinking about what kind of job he could do with his limitations, and he believed that he could work as a security guard or perhaps in some kind of supervisory role that didn't require manual dexterity. I was thrilled by this development, but also nervous. James had been rejected by so many things since his accident that I feared another disappointment might send him back into the depths of depression. But I supported his decision to start looking for work, knowing that regaining some sense of purpose and contribution was crucial for his recovery. The job search was challenging and discouraging. Many employers took one look at James's disabled hand and immediately dismissed him as a candidate. Others would go through the motions of an interview, but clearly had no intention of hiring someone with a visible disability. The rejections were painful for all of us to witness. But James persevered, and eventually, he found a position as a night security guard at a small office building downtown. The pay was much less than what he had earned at the factory, but it was honest work that he could do competently. More importantly, it gave him back some of his self-respect and sense of purpose. With both James and me working, our financial situation gradually improved. We were able to catch up on our mortgage payments and start rebuilding our small savings account. The children could see that things were getting better, and the atmosphere in our home began to lighten. David's grades improved as the stress at home decreased. He was still more serious and responsible than most 12-year-olds, but he began to enjoy childhood activities again. Sarah's nightmares stopped, and she returned to being the cheerful, talkative little girl she had been before the accident. But perhaps the most important change was in James himself. Working again, even in a different capacity than before, helped him rebuild his sense of identity and self-worth. He was still dealing with physical limitations and occasional bouts of depression, but he was functioning as a husband and father again. We learned to adapt to our new reality in countless small ways. James developed techniques for doing tasks with his left hand that he had always done with his right. We rearranged our home to make things more accessible for him. The children learned to help their father with tasks that were difficult for him, but in a way that preserved his dignity. The experience taught us all valuable lessons about resilience, adaptability, and the true meaning of family support. We learned that love isn't just about the good times, but about standing together when everything falls apart. We discovered strengths we didn't know we possessed and found ways to create joy even in difficult circumstances. Looking back now, I realize that the accident, devastating as it was, also brought our family closer together. We learned to appreciate each other in new ways and to never take our blessings for granted. David grew up to be an incredibly compassionate and responsible man, partly because of what he experienced during that difficult time. James never fully recovered the use of his right hand, but he lived a productive life for many years after the accident. He eventually started his own small business doing security consulting, using the knowledge he gained from his years as a night guard. He proved that disability doesn't have to mean the end of dreams, just the need to find new ways to pursue them. The isolation we experienced from some friends and family members during our crisis taught me the importance of reaching out to others in need. Throughout my life, whenever I heard of a family facing similar challenges, I made sure to offer practical help and emotional support. I never wanted anyone to feel as alone as we had felt during those dark months. Today, when I share this story, I want people to understand that life can change in an instant, and we must be prepared to adapt and support each other through whatever challenges come our way. Disability is not a tragedy, but it does require adjustments and understanding from everyone involved. I also want people to know that recovery from trauma, whether physical or emotional, is possible, but it takes time and patience. James's depression didn't disappear overnight, and our financial struggles didn't end immediately. But with persistence, love, and mutual support, we found our way to a new kind of happiness. Most importantly, I learned that strength comes not from avoiding difficulties, but from facing them head-on with determination and hope. Our family emerged from that crisis stronger and more united than we had been before, with a deeper appreciation for each other and for the gift of each ordinary day. The accident changed everything about our lives, but it didn't destroy us. Instead, it taught us what we were truly made of and showed us that love, determination, and family solidarity can overcome even the most daunting challenges. That lesson has sustained me throughout all the years since, through many other trials and tribulations. This story isn't just about surviving disability or financial crisis. It's about discovering that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary resilience when faced with circumstances they never imagined they would have to endure. We all have more strength than we know, but sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal it.